The day I found out, I was standing in my kitchen, making a cup of tea. That's the detail I always come back to, the ordinary, unremarkable fact of a kettle on a stove, steam beginning to curl toward the ceiling, while my whole chest was quietly caving in. My son had sent me a text, not a call, a text, 14 words. Mom, the christening is keeping it very small. We'll see you another time soon. I read it 3 times. I set my phone down on the counter. I picked it up and read it again. Then I stood there for a long time, long enough for the kettle to start screaming, and I didn't move to take it off the burner. I just stood there while it screamed the way I wanted to, and couldn't. Daniel is my only child. I raised him by myself after his father passed. When Daniel was 11 years old, I worked double shifts at Street, Mary's, for 6 years straight, so he could have the right shoes, the right backpack, the right everything, so the other kids wouldn't look at him the way kids look at each other when they can smell the difference. I ate sandwiches for lunch for 3 years so I could put money aside for his college applications. When he got into Northeastern, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. He is 35 now, an architect with a firm in Boston. He lives in a brownstone in the South End that cost more than I will earn in the rest of my working life. He married Vivienne 2 years ago at a venue in Newport that had a swan pond. I was there for that. I wore the navy dress I bought specifically because Vivienne had told me, gently but firmly, that the floral one I'd originally chosen was a bit much for the aesthetic. I wore the navy dress and I smiled in every photograph, and I told myself this was what success looked like. My boy had made it. That was enough. Now his son, my grandson, was being christened, and I had been told in 14 words not to come. I want to be clear about something. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. You don't spend 30 years as a labor and delivery nurse and stay fragile. I have held women's hands while they screamed and bled and pushed new life into a cold room at 3 a.m. I have delivered news that broke people open. I know what it means to hold yourself together when everything in you wants to come undone. But I sat down at my kitchen table that afternoon and I wept like I hadn't since the day we buried my husband. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I was humiliated, though I was that too. But because I understood, in the way you understand things that have been quietly true for a long time, that I had been disappearing from my son's life for years, and I had been too afraid to name it. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment from Vivienne at Thanksgiving about how I told stories that went on a bit long. A Christmas where they flew to her parents' place in Greenwich instead of coming to me. And I told myself that was fair, that was normal, that young couples rotate, a birthday dinner where I arrived to find her college friends already there, people I'd never met, and I spent most of the meal talking to their coats on the rack by the door because I couldn't find my way into a single conversation. I had told myself each of these things separately. I had never let myself add them up. I added them up now. I called Daniel that evening. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear the sounds of his life behind him. Vivian's voice somewhere, the soft noise of a television, the particular quiet of a house that costs money to maintain. "Mom," he said, and already his voice had that careful quality, the one he used when he was managing me. I told him I didn't understand. I told him this was my grandchild. I told him I had been planning this trip for 6 weeks, that I had already bought little James a baptism gift, a silver cross engraved with his name and birthday that had taken me 2 weeks to save for. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, Vivian's family is very particular about these things. The list got complicated. It really is going to be small." I asked him how small. He said, "Just immediate family and a few close friends." I said, "Daniel, I am your mother." He said, "I know. We'll do something just the 3 of us soon. I promise. You can come see James next month." Next month. Like I was a dentist appointment he'd have to reschedule. I didn't say what I was thinking. I said, okay, and I hung up, and I held the phone in my lap until my hands stopped shaking. What I was thinking was, I was in the room when you were born. I was the one who drove through a February ice storm to get to that hospital because I had worked all day and my car needed new tires I hadn't bought yet, and I was so terrified something would go wrong before I got there. I held you before your father did because he was still parking the car. You were 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and you smelled like the first good thing that had ever happened to me. And now you are telling me that I can come see my grandson next month, like he is a museum exhibit with specific visiting hours. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark in my house in Worcester, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about calling my sister in Phoenix, but I didn't want to say the words out loud yet, because saying them would make them real in a way I wasn't ready for. Instead, I opened Facebook on my phone. I don't use it much anymore, but I still have it. And sometimes Vivian posts photos, which is the only way I see my grandson most weeks. I scrolled through her page and I found what I think some part of me had already suspected I would find. A post from 2 days prior. A photo of an invitation. Pale blue. Calligraphy. Very elegant. And in the caption, the guest list is nearly at 80, and we are so excited to celebrate our sweet James with everyone who loves him. 80 people. I put the phone down on the nightstand. I turned off the lamp. I lay in the dark, and I thought, so this is what it has come to. 80 people were invited to my grandson's christening. I was not one of them. I want to tell you that I handled the next few days with grace and equanimity. I want to tell you that I made peace with it, that I found perspective, that I focused on what I had rather than what was being taken from me. But that would be a lie. And I am 62 years old and I have earned the right to stop lying to make other people comfortable. I was devastated. I was furious. I cleaned my entire house, which is what I do when I am those things. And then I cleaned it again. And on the third day, I went for a very long walk down by the reservoir where my husband and I used to walk when Daniel was small, and I let myself think about how my husband would have handled this if he were here. He would not have handled it quietly. Robert was a man who believed in saying the true thing plainly and letting the consequences sort themselves out. He would have driven to Boston and knocked on that brownstone door and stood on the front steps until someone let him in. He would have been impossible and embarrassing and completely, absolutely right. I missed him so much in that moment that it was almost funny. It was on the 4th day that I met Helen. I had driven into Boston for a reason I'm almost ashamed to admit now. I wanted to see Daniel's building. That was all. I parked around the corner and I sat in my car and I looked at the brownstone for a while, like I was a teenager with a crush. Like looking at the outside of the place where he lived could give me something the 14-word text had taken away. I'm not proud of it, but I did it. I was walking back to my car when I nearly ran into a woman coming out of the building next door. She was my age, maybe a year or two older, with silver hair cut short and the kind of posture that comes from years of being told to stand up straight. She was carrying a potted orchid with a blue ribbon tied around it. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping aside. She looked at me. Then she looked at the building I'd been staring at. Then she looked at me again with an expression I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror for 4 days. "Are you Margaret?" she said. I told her I was. "I'm Helen," she said. "Vivian's mother." We stood there on the sidewalk looking at each other for a moment. "The orchid is for the baby," she said. I left it with the doorman because I wasn't sure if dropping by unannounced was... She stopped. She glanced at the building again. "I've been standing here for 20 minutes, she said. I couldn't decide whether to ring the bell. I understood immediately. The way you understand some things without being told. Did she tell you not to come to the christening? I asked. Helen looked at me steadily. She told me we could come to the church service. The reception afterward is really for their Boston circle. Those were the words she used. Their Boston circle. She paused. I have a condo in Wellesley. I am 20 minutes away. I see my grandson twice a month if I am persistent about it. We went and had coffee at a place on Tremont Street. We were there for 3 hours. I learned that Helen had her own architecture, a whole structure of small exclusions and careful management that mirrored my own. She had been quietly moved to the edges of her daughter's life since the wedding, and she had, like me, told herself each individual thing separately and refused to add them up. She was a retired school principal. Her husband had died 4 years ago. She was warm and wry and sad in the particular way of women who are used to being competent and are not sure what to do when competence isn't enough. She wasn't like this before, Helen told me, turning her coffee cup in her hands. She was a good girl. She was kind. I don't know when she decided that where she came from was something to be managed rather than loved. I thought about Daniel saying Vivian's family is very particular about these things. I thought about how, at the Newport wedding, he had introduced me to her parents as my mom, Margaret, in a tone that meant, "Please don't embarrass me." I had smiled and shaken hands and not let myself hear the tone until right now, sitting in a coffee shop in Boston with his mother-in-law, adding things up. "What do we do?" I said. Helen set down her cup. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the people passing on the street. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 4 months, actually." She looked at me. "I think we go." I looked at her. "The christening is Sunday," she said. "It's at Street Anthony's in Brookline. Public church, public service. And the reception is at the Ames Estate Function Room in Newton, which I happen to know because Vivienne sent me the church address, and I recognize the neighborhood, and I know exactly what's on that block." She paused. "I'm not suggesting we make a scene. I'm not interested in ruining anyone's day. But I am James's grandmother. You are James's grandmother. And I think we have both been quiet and accommodating for long enough." I sat with that for a moment. Robert would have loved her. "Okay," I said. Adamin. So, the drive to Brookline on Sunday morning was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Helen had offered to pick me up, and she arrived at my house at 8:30 in a sensible gray sedan with a thermos of coffee and a calm, settled expression that I found steadying. We drove mostly in comfortable silence, which is its own kind of intimacy. I had worn my navy dress, the one from the wedding, and then I'd taken it off and stood in front of my closet for a long time. In the end, I wore a soft green dress I had bought for my retirement party 2 years ago, a dress I'd chosen for myself and not for anyone else's aesthetic. I put on the pearl earrings Robert gave me for our 20th anniversary, even though he never made it to our 21st. This has always been enough. Helen was wearing a cream blazer and a quiet confidence that I thought must have served her well for 30 years in a principal's office. We didn't talk strategy. There was no strategy. We were simply 2 grandmothers going to see a baby be baptized. Street Anthony's was a beautiful old church, dark wood pews, afternoon light coming sideways through stained glass, in colors that pooled on the stone floor. It was already half full when we arrived. We found a pew near the back and sat together without drawing attention. 2 older women, among many older women, the cousins and colleagues and neighbors of 2 families folded into a single Sunday morning. I saw Daniel before he saw me. He was standing near the front with Vivienne, who was holding James. My grandson was dressed in a long white christening gown that I recognized as an heirloom. I had seen a photo of Vivian's father in it once, decades ago, in a frame on her parents' wall. James was awake and looking around with the wide, evaluating expression that babies have when they are taking stock of the world and haven't decided yet what they think of it. He was beautiful. He had Daniel's eyes, that specific pale gray that had surprised me when Daniel was born, because no one in my family had eyes like that. And then I found a photo of Robert's grandmother and understood where they had come from. This small inheritance traveling down through blood. I sat in that pew and I watched my son stand at the front of the church holding his son, and I felt the grief and the love for him arrive at exactly the same moment, indistinguishable from each other, the way they had been arriving in me for as long as I could remember. The service was long and lovely. The priest had a gentle humor that made the older guests laugh and the babies unimpressed. When James was carried to the font and the water was poured over his head, he made a face of such profound personal affront that several people around us laughed. And I laughed too, quietly, and Helen put her hand briefly over mine on the pew. Daniel saw us during the recessional. He was walking out behind the priest, Vivienne beside him with James, and his eyes moved over the pews the way people's eyes do when they are looking for specific faces. And then his eyes found mine. He stopped walking. The person behind him nearly ran into him. He recovered quickly, took another step, looked forward. But in that fraction of a second, I had seen everything I needed to see. He had not expected us. He had believed we would not come. And somewhere in the surprise on his face, before he locked it down, there had been something that was not entirely unwelcome. Vivienne had not seen us. Not yet. The reception was held a mile away, at a function room in an old Newton estate, white tablecloths, arrangements of pale blue flowers, a table full of food that was beautiful and looked like no one was supposed to actually eat it. The room was full of people who dressed the way Helen and I did not dress, people from their Boston circle, the phrase that had cost Helen her invitation. We walked in together. I will not dramatize this into more than it was. We did not storm the gates. We did not demand attention. We simply walked through the door of that function room, as though we had every right to be there, which we did, and we found a table near the window, and we sat down. I had wondered how I would feel in that moment, whether the anger would rise up and make me say something that couldn't be unsaid, whether the grief would make me fragile in front of people I didn't know. But what I actually felt was a quiet, anchored calm, the kind that comes when you stop pretending. When you simply stand in a place and say, "By your presence, I exist. I am here. You do not get to make me invisible." Helen poured us each a glass of water from the carafe on the table, and we sat together, two women in the wrong circle, and we waited. Vivienne saw us first. She was moving through the room with James on her hip, receiving congratulations, and she turned and looked toward the window and stopped. I watched her face go through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, calculation, something that flickered briefly across her eyes that I thought might have been shame. She said something to the woman standing next to her and crossed the room toward us. I had prepared myself for this. I had not prepared myself for what I actually felt when she stood in front of me, which was sorrow not for myself but for her, for whatever it was in her that had decided the best way to build a life was to curate it so carefully that the people who loved her most didn't fit inside it. "Margaret," she said. "Helen." Her voice was controlled and even. "I didn't know you were coming. We're James's grandmothers," Helen said pleasantly. "We wanted to see him baptized." A pause. Vivian's jaw was tight. The baby in her arms reached out and grabbed a strand of her hair, and she gently unwound it, and in that moment, she looked 22 instead of 32. "The guest list," she started. "Vivienne," I said, and my voice came out quiet and steady in a way I was grateful for. "I'm not here to upset you or to cause a scene. I don't want an argument. I want to hold my grandson for 5 minutes. That is all I am asking for." Something moved through her then. I didn't know what it was. But she looked down at James, and then she looked at me, and after a long moment, she held him out. I took him. He was 8 weeks old and solid and warm in the particular way of babies who are well fed and loved. The weight of him settling into my arms with a completeness I had been missing for 2 months. He looked up at me with Daniel's gray eyes, and then he grabbed my finger, all 5 of his tiny ones wrapping around mine with the thoughtless, absolute trust of someone who has not yet learned to ration their affection. "Hello," I said softly. I'm your grandma, Margaret. I held him for longer than 5 minutes. Vivienne didn't take him back immediately. She stood there for a moment. Then she excused herself and walked toward another group of guests, and Helen leaned over and looked at James and said something quiet to him that made him startle and then stare at her with great intensity. I don't know what Vivienne was feeling in those minutes. I only know what I was feeling, which was love, the specific love of a grandmother, different from anything else, clear and total and completely, without the complexity that love between adults accumulates over years. Daniel found us 20 minutes later. He came across the room with 2 glasses of sparkling water, which was the kind of thing he did when he didn't know how to start a conversation, when he needed something to do with his hands. He looked like his father in that moment, more than he usually did. He gave 1 glass to Helen with a small, careful smile. Then he gave 1 to me. He sat down across from us and looked at his hands for a moment. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I know," I said. "Mom." "Daniel," I said. "I'm not going to make a speech. I'm not going to make you feel bad in front of your guests. But I need you to hear this, and I need you to actually hear it." I looked at him steadily. "I worked every day of my adult life to give you every opportunity I could. I did that without complaint and without keeping score, because that is what a parent does, and I would do it again without question. But I will not be managed out of your life. I will not be quietly moved to the edges until I disappear. I am your mother. This is my grandson, and I deserve better than a 14-word text telling me to stay home." Daniel said nothing for a long time. He looked at James, asleep in my arms now, the white christening gown rising and falling. "The text was wrong," he said. His voice was low. "I knew it when I sent it." "Then why?" "Because it was easier." He looked up at me, and there it was, the 11-year-old I had driven through the ice storm to see, the boy who had cried at his father's funeral with a kind of desperate composure that had broken my heart because he was trying so hard to be the man of the family already. Because Vivienne wanted a certain kind of day, and I didn't want to fight about it, and it was easier to just, "I'm sorry, Mom." He said the last part quietly, without theater. "I'm sorry." I looked at my son. I thought about all the ways love gets distorted under pressure, all the ways we hurt the people who are safest to hurt because they'll still be there afterward, because we know in some cellular way that they won't leave. "I'm going to need more than sorry," I said. "I'm going to need things to actually change." He nodded. "I want to see James. Regularly. Not next month when it's convenient." "Regularly." "Yes," he said. "And I want you to stop apologizing to the room for where you came from, for who I am." I said it without bitterness, just the bare fact of it. You are the person you are, because of the life we had. Daniel, the hard parts are included in that. I won't let you be ashamed of them. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet, which he was trying to manage in the way he always tried to manage things like that. "You're right," he said. Helen was quiet through this exchange, with a tact I appreciated deeply. She was looking out the window at the garden, giving us the conversation we needed, and I thought she would probably have a version of this same conversation with her daughter at some point soon, in her own way, in her own time. The rest of the afternoon was not perfect. Vivienne was cool and careful around me for the remainder of the party, polite in the way of someone who is holding several things at once. There were moments of awkwardness that no one pretended weren't there. I didn't expect transformation, and I didn't get it. But I held my grandson for 2 hours. I watched him sleep in my arms with the specific, complete peace that babies sleep with before they learn that the world requires anything of them. I watched Helen hold him and saw something settle in her that had been braced for a long time. I ate the beautiful food off the beautiful table. I talked to Daniel's college roommate, who had kind things to say about the person my son was, and I let myself receive them. At the end of the evening, Helen and I walked out together to the parking lot. The air had cooled, and the sky was streaked with that particular orange that only happens in October, the color that always made Robert reach for his camera. "Thank you," I said to her. She shook her head slightly. "Thank you," she said. We stood there for a moment in the parking lot, two women in their 60s with silver hair and sensible shoes. Two women who had raised children who had grown into adults, who were still, in so many ways, figuring out what mattered. "I think it's going to take time," Helen said. "All of it." "Yes," I said. "But we went," she said. "We showed up." I thought about that on the drive home. Through the orange sunset on the highway, through the last of the October light, I thought about what it means to show up, not to fight, not to demand, not to make anyone feel small, but simply to be present in your own life, to refuse the slow erasure, to walk through a door and say, by your presence, alone, "I am here. I am your mother. I am not done." I got home, and I took off the green dress, and I stood in my kitchen, and I made a cup of tea. The kettle screamed when it was ready, same as always, the ordinary, urgent sound of water reaching its limit. I took it off the burner this time. I poured it into the cup. I sat down at my table with the tea and the quiet house and the silver cross I had bought for my grandson still in my purse because I had forgotten to give it to him in the end. And I thought I would mail it tomorrow with a note or drive it down myself. I would drive it myself. I was not invisible. I was not manageable. I was not a footnote in my son's beautiful life. I was James's grandmother, and he had grabbed my finger with all 5 of his and held on. That was enough to start with, but only to start.